In a bustling city teeming with diversity, the air was thick with tension and unspoken fears. The community, a colorful tapestry of cultures and backgrounds, found itself at odds with those sworn to protect it, the police. Years of strained relations had led to a pervasive sense of distrust. Citizens whispered about their encounters with law enforcement, recounting stories of abuse and unfair treatment, especially towards marginalized groups. The tension was palpable, and amidst this backdrop, two officers took their positions in the precinct, each embodying different philosophies about their roles and responsibilities. Officer James Parker had seen it all. With over a decade of experience, he carried the weight of his badge with pride, but also with a keen awareness of its gravity. He understood the intricate dance of law and ethics, the delicate balance between maintaining order and ensuring justice. To him, being a police officer was not just about wielding authority, it was about upholding integrity and earning the community's trust. James was a man of principles, often seen engaging with locals, listening to their concerns, and striving to foster positive relationships. He was well respected among his colleagues but also viewed with suspicion by some, particularly the younger officers who saw his approach as naive in a field they believed required unwavering loyalty. Then there was Officer Eric Thompson, fresh out of the academy and eager to prove himself in the demanding world of law enforcement. He was ambitious and passionate, possessing a strong belief in the traditional notions of police camaraderie. To Eric, loyalty to one's fellow officers was paramount. It was the bedrock of a strong police force. He viewed the badge as a shield against the chaos of the world, believing that as long as he stood by his colleagues, he was doing his job right. However, this blind allegiance often clouded his judgment, blinding him to the nuances of accountability and fairness. On a typical afternoon, the precinct buzzed with activity. Officers were coming and going, the aroma of coffee mingled with the chatter and laughter echoing through the halls. James was deep in conversation with a community leader, discussing strategies to improve relations between the police and local neighborhoods. The dialogue was constructive, fueled by a mutual desire to create a safer environment for everyone. Meanwhile, Eric was in the midst of a different kind of interaction. He and his partner had been dispatched to a call regarding a disturbance in a nearby park. As they arrived, they observed a group of young men engaged in a heated argument, their voices raised and tempers flaring. Before assessing the situation thoroughly, Eric felt the adrenaline surge through him. Drawing on the training he had received, he believed that his first instinct should be to assert control and establish authority. Without pausing to evaluate the environment or the dynamics at play, Eric rushed forward, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. He shouted for everyone to step back, his tone commanding and aggressive. The young men, startled by the sudden appearance of police, instinctively complied, but not without frustration and confusion. James, who was en route to support his colleague, noticed the scene unfolding from a distance. He felt a sense of unease wash over him as he recognized the potential for escalation. As he arrived at the scene, James watched in dismay as Eric, fueled by his desire to assert dominance, began interrogating a young black man who had been trying to mediate the argument. The young man, calm and collected despite the tension, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of a barrage of accusations. Eric, believing he had sufficient cause, accused the man of being intoxicated, despite no evidence to support his claim. The young man's eyes widened in disbelief as the weight of the accusation bore down on him, rooted in the very biases that had plagued their community. James stepped forward, his heart racing as he interjected, determined to rectify the situation before it spiraled out of control. "Eric, hold on a second," he said firmly, positioning himself between the two men. "Let's take a moment to assess what's really happening here." The tension in the air crackled as the other officers on the scene shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react to the confrontation unfolding before them. "James, he's clearly under the influence. Look at him." Eric snapped, his tone filled with frustration. "We need to take action before this gets worse." But James remained resolute, his gaze steady and unwavering. "This isn't how we do things, Eric. We need to listen. We can't jump to conclusions based on assumptions." The young man, still reeling from the accusations, managed to regain his composure. "I'm not intoxicated. I was just trying to help. How can you not see that?" His voice was calm but filled with a mix of indignation and disbelief. James recognized the moment for what it was, an opportunity to bridge the gap, to show that not all officers were complicit in the biases that plagued their interactions. As the onlookers began to murmur, sensing the injustice that was occurring, James turned back to Eric, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about enforcing the law, it's about building trust. If we continue to act this way, we'll only deepen the divide. The conversation became a pivotal moment for both officers, revealing fundamental differences in their perspectives on policing and community relations. Eric, still brimming with the fire of impulsiveness, struggled to understand James's perspective. To him, being tough on crime was a test of his mettle, a means to prove himself. But in that instant, James offered him a glimpse of another way. In a city yearning for connection, James embodied the hope that justice could coexist with compassion and respect. This incident marked the beginning of an unfolding journey, a journey that would challenge not only their professional relationship, but also their very understandings of duty and integrity in a fractured world. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the park, the reality of the situation had set in. There was much work to be done, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. After the confrontation in the park, Officer James Parker found himself grappling with a storm of conflicting emotions. He walked the precinct hallways as if in a daze, his mind replaying the heated argument between himself and Officer Eric Thompson over and over. The thought of loyalty to a fellow officer waged war within him against the deep sense of moral obligation that compelled him to confront the misuse of power he had witnessed. He had spent years building relationships within the community, working tirelessly to earn their trust, and here he was, standing in the way of that trust due to a blind allegiance to the badge. As he sat at his desk, the cluttered papers in front of him blurred into a backdrop of despair. The precinct was buzzing with chatter, laughter, and the sounds of phones ringing, but James felt isolated in his thoughts. He could feel the weight of the stares from his colleagues, some casting glances filled with uncertainty. Those who had supported him in the past now seemed cautious, unsure whether they should align with the doctrine of silence that permeated their workplace. They hesitated, quietly questioning whether to side with a veteran officer fighting to uphold ethics or a young cop eager to prove his mettle within an unforgiving system. James knew he should take a stand. He wanted to challenge Eric's actions and push for a change in their policing methods. But could he expose a colleague in front of the others? He could already picture the backlash, the muttered complaints in the break room, the guarded responses during briefings, the looming threat that his decisions would paint a target on his back. He felt stuck between the pillars of accountability and the walls built by an unwritten code of silence. Every heartbeat echoed his dilemma: to defend his values or stay loyal to a corrupt system that bred conformity. The next day, James found himself had been assigned to a shift alongside Eric. The atmosphere was charged with an electricity that mirrored his tension. It was as if the precinct itself held its breath, waiting for an incident to spark the inevitable explosion. As they patrolled the streets together, James observed how Eric interacted with the public. What should have been approachable friendliness was cloaked in a thin veil of bravado. Eric's demeanor was rigid, and he often seemed on edge, quick to escalate small situations that required nothing more than conversation. People reacted to his presence with visible discomfort, and James felt a pang of regret for witnessing such a seasoned officer transform into someone so rigidly unwilling to empathize. During a routine traffic stop, James seized the moment to build some rapport with a driver. A middle-aged man in a worn-out pickup truck had been pulled over for a minor infraction. As James stepped up to the driver's side, he offered a reassuring smile, aiming to de-escalate the tension that often drifted into confrontations. "Good afternoon, sir. Just a routine check. Everything okay with you today?" James inquired, his tone warm and respectful. Eric stood nearby, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching with barely contained agitation. "We don't have all day, James," Eric broke in, his words sharp enough to slice through the cordial atmosphere. "We need to establish who's in charge." The driver, taken aback by Eric's abruptness, shifted nervously in his seat. James shot his partner a warning glance, a silent plea for him to dial it back. With every clash like this between them, James felt the rift widening. He wanted to pull Eric aside, to have a candid conversation about their contrasting approaches. He understood that Eric's experience was still fresh. He was overwhelmed with the pressures of his new role, but that didn't excuse his treatment of the very people they were supposed to protect. As the days wore on, the tension between the two officers bubbled beneath the surface, palpable enough that their colleagues whispered about it in hushed tones. Earlier, during a department meeting, the chief addressed the growing concerns about community relations. He emphasized the need for better practices and reinforced the importance of accountability. James felt emboldened by the chief's words, but also frightened by the realization that speaking up could lead to repercussions. He looked around the room at the faces not just of his colleagues, but of a fractured system, each person sitting silently, their thoughts lingering on the line drawn between loyalty and ethics. Eric's demeanor only intensified as the anxiety weighed on him. To him, James had become a traitor, someone threatening the camaraderie that he believed was vital to their work. He could sense that James was drifting away, questioning what it meant to be loyal. It fueled Eric with resentment, forcing him to put on an even more exaggerated front, which only served to isolate James further. They understood each other less and less. Their conversations turned cold and clipped, each frustrated interaction pushing them deeper into opposing corners. One afternoon, as they returned to the precinct after a long shift, the air crackled with unspoken words. The moment felt charged, as if both knew a storm was brewing. With adrenaline still pumping from their encounter with a difficult crowd, Eric turned to James, his frustration boiling over. "You need to have my back, man. This isn't just about being nice to the community. If you don't stand firm on your beliefs, they'll walk all over you." James felt a surge of defiance rise within him. "You think being a bully is the answer? We can't just strong-arm people into submission. That's exactly why there's a rift between us and the community. It's our job to build trust." Eric's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the precinct faded from view, leaving just the two men standing on the precipice of a professional and moral chasm. Around them, other officers moved about, their conversations fading into a murmur, sensing the tension that hung heavy in the air. As James prepared to voice the words that would confront the harsh reality of their choices, Eric sneered, "So, you'd throw me under the bus for them? For people who don't care about you? You're a cop first, remember that." The words stung, cutting deeper than James had anticipated. The silence that followed throbbed like a wound, leaving both men to grapple with the gulf widening between them. Without realizing it, everyone surrounding them had paused to witness the unfolding drama, a confrontation that mirrored the very struggles of the department and the community they worked for. James took a step back, the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. He felt trapped in the crossfire of loyalty and ethics, a battle that would require more than just words to resolve. As the reflection of their fractured relationship stared back at them, it became clear, the fight for justice was not simply about addressing the problems outside the precinct. It was also about facing the truths lying within, where shadows of complicity lurked, waiting to be unearthed. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows through the precinct windows, Officer James Parker felt an unsettling sense of dread creeping over him. He had hoped that the tension brewing between him and Officer Eric Thompson would fade, but instead, it had escalated into something far more toxic. They had been called to a neighborhood known for its struggles, a place where tensions were raw and every interaction was charged. As they approached the scene, James could feel the weight of the air, thick with anxiety and mistrust. It all began when they responded to a domestic disturbance. The moment they arrived, James's instincts kicked in. A young black man stood outside a worn-down apartment, visibly distressed, his hands raised slightly in a display of surrender. Behind him, a cacophony of shouting echoed from within the building. James advanced carefully, aiming to defuse the situation, while Eric, charged by adrenaline and perhaps a desire to assert dominance, moved in aggressively. "Step away from the door," Eric shouted, his voice booming. The man flinched at the harshness, but his demeanor remained defensive, a mixture of rebellion and fear flashing across his face. James caught Eric's eye, silently urging him to dial back the aggression, to meet the man with humanity. But Eric seemed undeterred, fueled by a sense of entitlement that had only deepened since their earlier confrontations. "Just calm down, man. We're here to help," James interjected, attempting to bridge the gap. But Eric's response took James by surprise. Before he could react, Eric lunged forward and shoved the young man against the wall, his actions a reckless display of force that James never expected from a fellow officer. The sound of the man's body colliding with the bricks echoed like a gunshot. "Eric, stop that!" James shouted, feeling his heart race. "Get your hands off him!" But Eric's expression hardened, and he leaned closer, practically growling, "This is how you teach these guys a lesson. They respect strength, not sympathy." James felt the world stutter to a halt in that moment. He gripped his radio tightly, fighting the urge to call for backup. It felt more like a plea for sanity than a request for assistance. The young man's eyes brimmed with fear, and the reality of their roles twisted painfully in James's mind. He had spent years trying to build bridges with the community, only to find himself standing beside someone whose actions could shatter any semblance of trust they had fought so hard to establish. "Let him go, Eric," James said again, this time his voice steady but laced with desperation. "This isn't how we do things. He hasn't done anything wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. the reality of what it meant to wear the badge, to stand for justice. But Eric merely scoffed, taking a step closer to the man, who was now visibly shaking. "You're soft, Parker. You can't change this world by being nice to everyone." The tension crackled between them, and in that moment, a decision crystallized in James's mind. He realized that he could no longer be silent, that complicity in Eric's actions would strip away everything he believed in. Enough. The shout came from deep within James, raw and overflowing with conviction. It was a command, laced with the weight of everything he had bottled up over the past weeks. Eric paused, taken aback by the fierceness of James's tone. In that fleeting moment, James saw a flicker of doubt cross Eric's face, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "You're making a mistake, James," Eric warned, his eyes narrowing. "No, you're the one making a mistake." James's heart raced as he stepped between Eric and the young man, his own resolve bolstered by the knowledge that he could not stand idly by. "I'm placing you under arrest for excessive force. You've crossed a line." The air felt electric, and for a heartbeat, the world around them faded. The shocked silence that enveloped the alley was almost deafening, as if the universe held its breath, waiting for the next move. Eric's jaw clenched, and the tension thickened, rippling through the gathering crowd of onlookers, their faces etched with uncertainty and fear. James could see the murmurs beginning, as the crowd processed what had just unfolded. Eric's laughter was harsh and bitter. "You think this will make a difference? You think they'll side with you?" "Maybe not," James replied, his voice low yet firm. "But I can't be part of this. Not anymore." He took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest as he reached for his handcuffs, the metallic clinking mixing with the hushed gasps from the spectators. Arresting a fellow officer was a draconian step that could shatter his life, and yet in that instant, it felt like a breath of liberation. Moving with a precision he didn't know he possessed, James secured the cuffs around Eric's wrists, maintaining eye contact as he did so. The moment was surreal, every nerve in his body tingled with adrenaline, the gravity of his actions weighing heavily upon him. He had crossed a threshold, plunging into uncharted waters that would inevitably alter the path of his life, and Eric's. As he led Eric toward their patrol car, the atmosphere in the precinct erupted, a whirlwind of chaos as officers buzzed with outrage and disbelief at the shocking turn of events. James had expected resistance, but the force of indignation took him by surprise. Many of his colleagues were incensed, a chorus of voices rising in protest as they declared him a traitor to their brotherhood. "James, you can't do this," shouted Officer Martinez, a veteran officer whom James had always respected. "He's one of us." The betrayal was palpable, echoing through the assembled officers like a death knell. "You're just going to toss aside loyalty for what? A fleeting moment of morality." Rage and disbelief reverberated throughout the precinct. Those James had called friends turned their backs, expression filled with disappointment and bitterness. Whispers of traitor and loyalty filled the air, punctuated by the shuffling of feet and the clattering of equipment being put aside. James felt the sting of their accusations, the weight of their anger crashing over him like a tidal wave. The badge felt heavier on his chest, a symbol of a fractured solidarity that seemed to be breaking all around him. "What you did was a slap in the face to every officer in this department," shouted another colleague, anger simmering just beneath the surface. A few officers stood back, watching the confrontation unfold, uncertain of where they fit into this growing schism. James had always believed that doing the right thing would be lauded, but now he was painfully aware that he was an outcast. In his pursuit of justice, he had unwittingly signed his own exile from the community he had once called home. With every passing moment, the realization settled in that he had not only confronted a corrupt system, but had also catalyzed an internal struggle among his peers. Tensions had been simmering beneath the surface, and now they were exposed in full force, splitting the department into those who sought reform and those who clung to tradition and camaraderie above all else. As the uproar continued, James locked eyes with Eric, who had been silent throughout the commotion. For a brief moment, the anger and disappointment faded into something deeper, a profound sadness illuminated by the recognition of their shared history and the chasm that had opened between them. Eric had once been a friend, a partner in arms, but now stood before him as a man broken by his own choices. James moved through the crowd, surrounded by a cacophony of voices, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew that this was just the beginning. The way forward would be fraught with challenges, and the road to reform would be long and arduous. But he was no longer willing to remain silent, to turn a blind eye to the injustices that surrounded him. As he stepped further into the clinic of change, he understood that he had ignited a fire not only in himself but within the department itself, a fire that could no longer be contained. In the days that followed Officer James Parker's shocking decision to arrest his colleague, the atmosphere within the precinct grew increasingly toxic. Whispers laced with suspicion filled the hallways, and where once there had been camaraderie among officers, now there was a palpable rift, deepening like an unhealed wound. Many of his fellow officers regarded him with open hostility, branding him an informant, a traitor who had dared to expose one of their own. The badge that had once symbolized unity now felt like a heavy chain around his neck, each link forged from the resentment and disdain of those who once stood beside him. James found himself navigating a hostile landscape, his once friendly exchanges now fraught with tension. He could hear the hushed conversations as he walked past groups of officers, their heads tilting in his direction as the murmurs turned into pointed glares. It was disheartening. Fellow officers, the same ones he had trusted and laughed with, were now quick to turn their backs, robbing him of the support he had come to rely on. The very essence of loyalty, the unspoken bond among those sworn to protect, had been shattered. Every day became a test of endurance. James braced himself for the inevitable backlash. During roll call, he felt the weight of scrutinizing stares, a silent judgment hanging in the air. He could almost sense the accusations bubbling beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to rise and engulf him. The repercussions of his decision extended beyond his interactions within the precinct. Rumors began to infiltrate the local community, sowing seeds of doubt and suspicion about his integrity. Friends became scarce, and his safe haven transformed into an isolating cage. In the weeks that followed, he faced threats to his career. His ability to achieve promotions and accolades was abruptly overshadowed by a looming question: could he still be trusted? His superiors, unsure of how to navigate the divisions wrought by his act of defiance, treated James with a peculiar mixture of respect and caution. They would praise his actions in private settings, yet he felt the chill of their hesitance in public. Caught between two worlds, James endured sleepless nights reflecting on the path he had chosen. Was it worth sacrificing his career for the ideals he so deeply believed in? Yet, amid the darkness, he clung to the hope that change could emerge from the chaos. He was resolute in his belief that the integrity of the badge should never be compromised, that true justice meant holding each other accountable, not just those in their community, but also within their ranks. However, the oppressive atmosphere threatened to consume him, gnawing at his spirit with every cold shoulder and contemptuous whisper. Just when James thought the divisions could never be bridged, a familiar voice cut through the tension, demanding attention. Chief Montgomery stood tall at the front of the precinct, exuding an authority tempered by empathy. The murmurs settled as officers turned their focus toward him, curiosity mixed with apprehension. His presence commanded respect, and for a moment, James felt a glimmer of hope. "Listen up," Chief Montgomery began, his tone firm yet measured. "We need to talk." The room shifted as he gestured for everyone to gather, the air thick with anticipation. What has transpired over the past few weeks should concern us all. We are not just colleagues who wear the same uniform, we are a team, built on trust and shared values. Lately, that trust has eroded. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, capturing the attention of even the most skeptical officers. James Parker made a difficult choice, one that many of you clearly disagree with. But we cannot overlook the underlying issues that led him to that point. Abuse of power, racial prejudice, and a failure to hold each other accountable erode the very foundation of what we stand for. More murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of disbelief and unease as they processed Montgomery's viewpoint. It's time we confront these issues head-on rather than sweep them under the rug. Ignoring them only perpetuates a cycle of fear and mistrust, not just within our team, but in the community we serve. We are trained to protect and serve, and that responsibility extends to each other. Chief Montgomery's gaze shifted, landing on James. What happened here was a wake-up call. It showed us that we have to address our own shortcomings, and I commend James for having the courage to stand up in the face of adversity. As the chief continued to speak, James felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, someone was acknowledging the pain, fear, and frustration that had gripped them, and he began to sense a shift in the atmosphere. The chief appealed to their shared humanity, urging them to embrace a new framework of accountability, one that would foster trust among officers and build deeper connections with the community. Moving forward, we will implement comprehensive training on racial bias, ethical responsibility, and the importance of open dialogue. We must create an environment where every officer feels safe to speak up, where the abuse of power is not only condemned but actively challenged. The room, once filled with hostility and skepticism, began to pulsate with a new energy. The officers shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that hinted at a willingness to embrace change. Even the most hardened skeptics began to reconsider as Chief Montgomery laid out a vision for their future. A future where the badge represented not only authority but also compassion, understanding, and fairness. As the meeting concluded, James stepped outside, feeling a sense of renewal. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The road to healing and change was fraught with challenges. The distrust and resentment wouldn't dissipate overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. Encouragement filled the air, as officers began to engage in conversations about accountability, forming alliances focused on reform rather than division. In the days that followed, James found himself at the heart of discussions about the future of their precinct. Colleagues he once thought would never speak to him again began to open up, discussing their perspectives on bias and the importance of community trust. Slowly but surely, the tide started to turn, and James began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. The training sessions designed to address biases and accountability became a turning point for the precinct. Officers participated with varying levels of enthusiasm, but as discussions progressed, many began to confront their own preconceived notions and biases. Sharing personal experiences helped break down walls, moving them towards a common goal of fostering a more inclusive environment. In time, the precinct transformed into a hub of mutual respect and understanding. Each day brought new challenges, but with each challenge came an opportunity for growth. James watched as the rift that had threatened to swallow them transformed into a foundation for unity. He felt a sense of fulfillment, a quiet pride knowing that his courageous decision to stand against injustice had sparked a significant change not just within him but within his entire team. While the battles ahead would not always be easy, James understood leadership was about resilience and standing firm in one's convictions. Together with his colleagues, he embraced the path of transformation, holding tight to the belief that a united front, one that acknowledged its flaws, would ultimately pave the way for justice, integrity, and healing in their community. As Officer James Parker navigated the precinct in the months following the transformative training sessions, he felt a gradual change in the atmosphere. The tumultuous shadows of division had begun to dissipate, revealing glimpses of reconciliation and renewed camaraderie among his colleagues. The halls, once filled with hushed whispers and hostile glances, now resonated with lively discussions and shared laughter. The officers were learning to value the importance of empathy and understanding as they moved beyond their past grievances, creating a more united front in their mission to serve the community. The shift was palpable, and it brought with it a renewed sense of purpose. James had dedicated himself not only to his work but also to nurturing this change. He engaged in conversations with officers who had once ostracized him, listening to their perspectives and sharing his own experiences. These intimate exchanges fostered an environment ripe for growth, a culture that encouraged dialogue rather than silence. With each passing day, walls that had once seemed impenetrable began to crumble, making way for a sense of belonging and trust that James had longed to see. The precinct embraced its commitment to accountability and responsibility. The training had served as a catalyst, igniting a movement among officers to confront their biases and recognize the critical importance of their roles in the community. James watched in awe as his fellow officers challenged one another, not in anger but in an earnest desire to better themselves and the department. They became more than protectors of the law. They emerged as advocates for justice, responsible for their actions and the impact those actions had on the people they served. As the years passed, the ripple effects of that fateful event and the subsequent changes in the precinct began to reshape the very fabric of the community. Citizens started to notice the difference. The interactions between officers and residents became increasingly collaborative, with officers taking time to engage with the community on a personal level. They organized events that not only showcased their commitment to protecting, but also their passion for understanding the needs and concerns of those they served. Communities that had once felt distance began to unite with their local police force, fostering a bond rooted in mutual respect and accountability. Officer James Parker often found himself at the forefront of these initiatives, proud to be part of the movement toward change. He became a mentor for younger recruits, guiding them through the complex dynamics of police work while instilling in them the values of integrity and the necessity of ethical responsibility. He shared his own journey, emphasizing that accountability was not just a duty, it was an honor. With every interaction, he hoped to inspire them to embody these principles, ensuring that the lessons learned from their past would not be forgotten. However, James also knew that the path to lasting change was not without its challenges. Every so often, he encountered individuals who had yet to embrace the idea that a new era was possible. Old habits were hard to break, and some officers resisted the push for reform, clinging to entrenched beliefs that had been passed down through generations. Yet, instead of seeking confrontation, James approached these moments with patience and understanding. He recognized that transformation takes time, and that fostering dialogue was key to bridging the gaps that still remained. One day, as James sat in a reflective moment, he received an unexpected visit from Chief Montgomery. The chief had been following the progress of the precinct with keen interest, noting the positive changes and the blossoming relationships within the department and with the community. He praised James for his unwavering dedication to the cause, acknowledging the pivotal role he played in shaping the precinct's renewed culture. "James," Montgomery said, leaning back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face, "what we've built here goes beyond protocol and policy. You've helped forge a new heart for this precinct, one that is anchored in integrity and ethical responsibility. You've shown your colleagues the power of standing up against wrongdoing, teaching them that each of us carries the weight of our actions." James smiled, appreciating the chief's acknowledgement, yet he felt a sense of humility wash over him. "It's not just me, Chief. It's all of us. The changes we've seen are a collective effort. Everyone has played a part in moving us forward. The real challenge now is to ensure that this commitment endures, that we hold each other accountable, and that we never lose sight of why we do this work in the first place." Montgomery nodded, understanding the depth of James's sentiment. "You're right, and I have faith that with leaders like you, this shift will resonate throughout our ranks. We must not become complacent. Instead, we should strive to be the standard-bearers for law enforcement everywhere. Our community deserves that from us." In that moment, James realized that the lessons learned, both from his own experience and from the journey the precinct had undertaken, were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger narrative about justice, compassion, and the power of accountability. The work they were doing was building a foundation for a future where integrity became the norm rather than the exception. As he looked out of the precinct window, watching officers engaging positively with community members, James felt a sense of hope swell within him. The road ahead would undoubtedly present challenges, but he was confident in the resilience and commitment of his fellow officers. Together, they were not just policing a community, they were actively shaping a better future. The importance of individual responsibility and integrity was clear. Each officer's decisions rippled outwards, impacting their relationships with the community and one another. They were not merely enforcers of the law but also stewards of trust, a fact that would shape their legacy moving forward. James knew that by continuing to cultivate understanding and collaboration, they would create a law enforcement environment built on respect and fairness, where every officer upheld the values they had fought so hard to establish. As seasons changed and years passed, the precinct became a beacon of hope for many. It stood as a testament to the power of standing up for what is right, the impact of collective change, and the realization that, ultimately, integrity and accountability could pave the way for a more just world. James Parker remained steadfast in his commitment, forever inspired by the journey that began with one courageous act and flourished into a community bonded by respect and purpose. He understood now that true change was not seamless. It was messy, challenging, and profoundly rewarding, culminating in a vision of law enforcement that mirrored the diverse, vibrant communities they swore to protect.